Good morning. Welcome to our first session of our four-session day for, I hate to call it the procrastinator session. December comes very quickly, but we are offering a bevy of great presentations today for those that are interested and have need or want to learn more. I am going to give a few minutes to Natty. If you guys, we do have chat going, so if you want to pop in and say good morning and say where you're calling in from, that'd be great. We will take note of questions behind the scenes. We will, at good intervals, ask our presenter, Ron, some questions as we go, and then we may stack some up for the end. Let's see, we're going to let a few more people in. About 30 seconds, and then we'll get started. Oh, someone's calling in from the Charlotte airport. Okay. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the whole presentation. Kalamazoo, thank you. Somerset, Ohio. Good morning. Tucson, of course, that's our host that does all these. Daniel, he is the man behind all of the mind work that happens here.
Halifax.
Okay. And from the Smokies. Excellent. And Spokane. We're all across. Oh, and Nova Scotia. Wow. Good morning. Afternoon, evening. I'm not exactly sure what it is there. Others from Ohio. Good. Okay, well, let's get this started. I am going to, my name is Stacy Sire, and I am the current president of our CSINext chapter. I want to introduce Ron Geren, who is he actually lives here in Phoenix, where I live. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, and I know him a little bit personally, which is fantastic. But this is a man, myth, and legend. But let me read my introduction that I have for him. Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Ron. He's the owner of RLGA Technical Services in Scottsdale, Arizona. He has more than 35 years of experience with an impressive range of projects. And so he brings a depth of practical knowledge that is hard to match or beat. When he's not shaping projects, he is shaping minds. He is a professor of architecture at the School of Architecture at Taliesin, where he teaches construction documents, building codes, practice management, and building construction technology. He also serves on the AIA Codes and Standards Committee, helping influence standards that guide you and I every single day with what we're trying to do and put together behind the scenes. Ron is the author of the book Applying the Building Codes, Step-by-Step Guide for Building and Design and Building Professionals. And his credentials read like a greatest hits of construction expertise, including board chair of the CSI. I have personally been at conferences where Ron has been in attendance, left to fly to meet with ICC regarding codes or proposal changes for codes, and then flies back to fulfill the rest of his duties at conferences. So let's suffice it to say that he's more than a codes expert. He really is an advocate and an ever-present activist for safety, wisdom, and practicality in our industry. And I thank you for everything that you do for us, Ron, behind the scenes. With that, take it away, and thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy. Want to thank Lane Booker for inviting me to do this presentation. This is something near and dear to my heart, and it's a program that I developed about 15 years ago this year. I was asked to do a keynote for the Salt Lake City chapter's education symposium, and they asked me, well, what do you? I asked them, what do you want me to speak on? And they said, well, why don't you speak on something on how to apply the code? And I never really thought about it, so I sat down and I kind of created this 28-step process, and from there it grew into um, a program that I've taught at the collegiate level. It's now called the School of Architecture, founded by Frank Lloyd Wright, since we've left the Taliesin properties. But I've been teaching it there for at least 12, 14 years now, 14 years, and then I made a book out of it. The book is out of print, but I got the rights back from Wiley, and I'm working on an update. So, and I'll be self-printing that. So look for that. Probably, I was hoping to get it out this fourth quarter of 2025. It's looking more like it's going to be about mid-year 2026. So move on in. Today's objectives going to differentiate between or how the building code application process is used at the design phase versus the code application process that your building department will apply. We'll discuss a little about locating code information and identifying defined terms, and kind of explain how code compliance is applied at all phases of the project, from schematic design through design development and construction documents. And then you should be able to utilize this standard, what I call a standard step-by-step process for code analysis that can be applied to any type of project. So to kind of start off, this is from a conversation. So this is supposedly an actual interaction between a building official and a contractor who called in. Uh, this was shared by a building official on a code discussion forum about 20 years ago on the now defunct ICC discussion forum. I think he was a building official out of Oklahoma somewhere. Um, and it really illustrates the importance of understanding what the building code is and how to apply it properly. Obviously, this contractor had no clue what was the difference between a 1 hour wall, a 2 hour wall, and a 3 hour wall. So the code application process during design is what I like to compare it to travel planning. Whether you're driving, taking the plane or the train, each one of those methods are applicable. And even when if you're driving, it's a matter of what route you're going to take, what sites you're going to see along the way. The whole thing is you're getting from point A to point B. And when it comes to a code application process, you're trying to do the same thing. You're starting from the beginning, and you want to end with a building permit and get into construction. That's point A and point B. How you get there in between roughly depends upon the direction you take when it comes to designing the project. You can take various routes or approaches and still come up with a permit at the end of the project. And like whoops, and like most planning processes, things happen along the way. If you're driving, you may have a breakdown in the car and you have to go and get it repaired, or you see an extra attraction that you want to stop at. So you're making changes to your plan along the way. Same thing with the code application process. You start off with one approach, and then as you go through that approach, things happen. Design changes, uh, owner comes in with new requirements, things like that, that you have to address, and sometimes that may modify the approach that you take on your code application process. Okay. But when you're applying the building code during the jurisdictional plan review process, it's completely different, because the plan reviewer is actually starting from a supposedly complete project. They've got all the information right in front of them. All they're doing is back checking to make sure that you've addressed every single point that is required to be addressed. And sometimes they miss things, but it is there. You may call it a quality control process because it's after the fact. All the work has already been done. They're doing a check to make sure that the building does comply. And then the end result is you either get a permit, you pass, or you fail, and you get a list of corrections that you have to go back and change. So this design process is the best solution is to create a code compliance what I call a code compliance strategy. Uh, you're working off of minimal information. Excuse me. The only information that you really have, especially at the beginning of the project, is that programming document that the owner gave you. And in some cases, that is the additional service that you're required to have or provide for the owner is to develop that program for them. So even then, you're starting with zero information at that point, other than you have a pretty good idea what the project is. From my macro perspective, you know it's either going to be an office building, a hospital, or a school, or whatever. So you have some general idea of what you're starting with. But you're really starting with minimal information. And then how that code applies really depends on the tactics that you as designers take along that process in order to address specific code issues, room sizes, materials, cost is going to affect that. So there's a lot of things that play into the code application process. Finding information. This is uh, probably one of the hardest things that you'll end up having to deal with when it comes to the code is finding out exactly where everything is. The key to knowing where that information is one, be familiar with the chapter organization. The chapters have not changed, well, at least for those of us under the UBC. Well, I take that back. Back in 94, when all three model building code agencies got together, they created a standard chapter organization. And from that point on, regardless if you were in the Southern Building Code or the National Building Code or the Uniform Building Code, all the chapters were the same. So if you've been in this business for longer than 30 years, you may have experienced a different chapter organization under the various codes, but the chapters have really not changed since 1994, regardless if you're in pre-IBC or post-IBC. So knowing where those chapters are and what those chapters contain will take you about 75% of the way. And then you have to kind of do some research within each of those chapters to figure out your specific requirements. Um, you know that chapter three is, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but chapter three gets into occupancy groups. If you know what kind of occupancy group, obviously chapter three will set you off with some basic requirements there at the beginning, but you also need to look at chapter four, which gets into special provisions for special types of occupancy. So don't just look at chapter three, you have to look at chapter four, and those are two separate steps that we'll get into. And I try to pound this into every student that I've had and every lecture that I give on building codes. Don't try to memorize the code. Now, by default, you're going to start memorizing things, but even if you do memorize something, don't rely on your memory because it can lead to errors, especially if you remember something in one code edition and the jurisdiction's in a new code edition, and you think that you're under the old code or the requirements haven't changed, then you could create an error there and it could be detrimental to you. Another reason is that each jurisdiction may have amendments. If you're working in California, which heavily modifies the IBC, and then you go somewhere out east, it'll be a whole different environment for you. And the code is going to be a completely the structure is going to be the same, but some of the content's going to be significantly different. So you have to be aware of those modifications by local regions. Another thing to know is to understand your definitions. And what you may think is a correct definition is not really what the building code thinks that definition is. So, for example, the word approved. If you ask somebody if something was approved, you would ask by whom? You know, is it the jurisdiction? Is it the architect? Is it the contractor? It doesn't, if the code says it has to be approved by somebody, who is that approving authority? Well, if you go into the IBC and look up the definition of the word approved, it says acceptable to the building official. So if you want to use a product and then the code says or any other approved material, it gives you a prescriptive requirement and then says any approved material. If you want to use something other than what the prescriptive material is, you have to go into the building official to get that approval. Some jurisdictions like California and Florida have approval systems already in place, so you can go and take a look at their listing to see if something's already been approved for those particular jurisdictions. If not, then you'll have to go through the approval process. For those of us outside of California and Florida, where they have those, and I'm sure there's some other jurisdictions out there that have similar situations. But if you don't have a structured system like that, sometimes it's just a matter of going to your building official and asking the question, is this something that would be acceptable? If they give you an answer and they say yes, have them put it in writing. That way you have something documented later on, should the inspector come out there and say, hey, this isn't an approved material, you have something in writing to show that it has been approved. All definitions are found in Chapter 2. If you've been around long enough, you remember that each of the chapters had those definitions that are applicable to that chapter. And then they moved everything to Chapter 2. And I'm going to use this diagram as an illustration. You'll see this a couple more times in the presentation. But everything that you see italicized in there is a defined term. Even the headers there for the four parts of the means of egress system. Means of egress is defined, and it's defined as being the exit access, the exit discharge, and the public way. And so each of those have various components, and each of those components are defined terms if they're italicized in that list. So anytime the IBC italicizes a word or a series of words, that means those are defined somewhere in Chapter 2. So let's get into the step-by-step process. It's a 28-step process. I tried to make it a 12-step process when I first started, so I could say this is my 12-step process for code application for architects. And somebody told me it was a good thing I didn't do that, because all the 12-step organizations out there could have sued me for copyright. So it's a 28-step process. Yes, it's a little bit daunting, but it's actually turned out to be necessary to have these individual steps. Schematic design almost includes 50% of them. And that's because there is so much that happens early on in the project design that you have to make some significant code decisions that affect the design later on. So many of these decisions that you make during schematic design, you want to make sure that you make them during schematic design, because if you hold off until design development, or even worse, construction documents, you may find yourself going back to the drawing board and redoing either the whole building or a good portion of the building. And if you're hired to do programming, some of those steps can be done during the programming phase, just based off the programming areas that you're going to be given by your client. Design development has 8 steps within that, and those 8 steps get into more detail on the design itself, just like design development is intended to be. You want to start putting muscle and meat on the skeletal frame that we constructed in schematic design. And then construction documents has 7 steps, and it's basically detailing everything based on the selected material and construction type that you're building the building for. So let's start off with schematic design. This should go as a no duh, but believe me, people skipped over this. Know what building code you're working with. And as I mentioned before, under memorization, you may remember something in the 2018 IBC, but it may have changed in the 2024, and the jurisdiction that you're doing a project for is under the 2024. You want to make sure you go out and get a copy of the 2024 building code. A good friend of mine, when he was working for an architecture firm, the firm would buy a building code book for every project. And that book would live with that project. They would highlight all the content, tag things, everything. That would become a file document along with the project. So you can do that. They're kind of pricey, but they're not all that expensive that a nice size project couldn't cover. So make sure that you understand. And I have a great anecdote for this. A well-known architect was doing a project, and it was under at this time, I think it was the 2009 IBC was what was adopted. And they only had the copy of the 2006 in their library, so they were using the 2006 IBC to design the project. And if anybody here is familiar with what happened in 2009 IBC in application of occupant load calculations, they got rid of the reduction uh, um, of the factors for egress width, and their egress system was way undersized. And we had to go in and modify and readjust uh, the, uh, the the code loading or the occupant loading on the means of egress system. We were able to make it work with some minor changes, but it could have been a disaster if it was much worse. Step 2 is try to obtain as much essential information that you can about the project. Things like what's the building area. You can take that, get that information rather quickly off of the programming document. You can get the total area. If they don't have square footage there for circulation and all of that, you can factor in a certain percentage that is typical of those types of buildings. Throw that in there to get a rough order of magnitude for the building area, and you can use that to kind of make some initial decisions. How many stories is it going to be? And that could be dictated by programming, or that could be dictated by the site. If the program area is much larger than the site and you have setbacks and all of that, that'll kind of dictate what your maximum footprint is going to be for that building. So that may dictate the number of stories, whether you're going up or going down. Is the building going to be sprinklered? And because that will change a lot of decisions. It could affect a lot of decisions later on. In some cases, you're forced to do it. Like here in Phoenix, Arizona, Phoenix requires any building structure over 400 square feet to have a sprinkler system, regardless. You get all the freebies with it that goes what we call sprinkler trade-offs. You get all of those by doing that, but the jurisdiction requires that. So if the jurisdiction doesn't require it, ask your owner if they want to, and then whether or not you're required to have it as a condition of the type of occupancy that you're working with. Another one is what kind of materials do you want to use on the project? Are you going to be wood frame, concrete, whatever? Just kind of put some thoughts together, because that'll point you in the direction when we come to determining construction type. And then determine if what your climate zone is, because that's going to dictate your building thermal envelope elements. And then your flood zone, whether or not you're in a floodplain, a 100-year floodplain. If you are, then there are certain things that you're going to have to do in order to address that flood elevation level. The next step, based on that programming document, you can determine what the occupancy groups are. In most cases, buildings are going to be multiple occupancy. So you want to look at all elements of the building to determine what the various occupancy groups are going to be in there. Obviously, there's probably going to be one major occupancy group. And in rare occasions, you may have a single occupancy building. But in most cases, a lot of the buildings will have multiple occupancies. So look at Chapter 3 and go through that to determine what your occupancy groups are. Step 4 is now take a look at your construction type based on those materials that you decided that you wanted to build your building with or design your building with. There are 5 construction types. Type 1, 2, and 3, or type 1 and 2 are considered non-combustible. Type 3, 4, and 5 are considered combustible. And with each one of those comes certain fire resistant requirements for certain building elements. So you need to take a look at Chapter 6 in regards to what type of fire resistance are required. The type of materials affect the allowable area and the allowable height. So, or I should say the construction type will determine the building area and the allowable height. Something to keep in mind is under the 2024 IBC, they introduced 3 new Type 4 constructions for tall wood buildings. So those are new in the 2024 IBC. Step 5 is to determine how mixed uses and occupancies will be handled. So this is the situation I just talked about where most buildings are going to be what we call a mixed use. More than one occupancy group will be present in that building. And how you handle that, you have options. Again, this is part of your code compliance strategy. You can consider them accessory occupancies, provided that they don't exceed more than 10% of the floor area in which they're located. And that's the aggregate sum, not just 10% of one occupancy and a 10% for another occupancy. You have to take all the accessory occupancies that you're going to use, total up the entire area of all of those, and if it's less than 10% of that floor area, you can call it an accessory occupancy, no separation. You still have to classify them according to their occupancy group, but they do not dictate allowable area or height. Another option is, if you can't call it an accessory occupancy, is call it a non-separated occupancy. A non-separated occupancy means that you have multiple occupancy groups, and then table 508.4, I can't remember the exact number now, will identify what are the required firewall or fire separation requirements between occupancy groups. With a non-separated occupancy separation, that means you don't provide any separation between the occupancy groups, but now everything is dictated by the occupancy group that is most restrictive in regards to height and area. And then there's the separated occupancies where you actually follow the table, separate all the occupancy groups by the fire rated fire barrier requirements, 1-2 hour ratings typically, whether you're sprinklered or non-sprinklered. And then you do a ratio. You take the allowable area for that particular occupancy and the actual area, divide those to get a ratio, add up all the ratios, and as long as you're less than 1, then that particular floor is okay. For a building that's more than 3 stories uh, high, if the area is if the sum of the ratios for the entire building is less than 3, you're okay. Or, just to complicate things, you can do a combination of any one of those three. You can do an accessory occupancy and non in a separated occupancy. You can do a combination. Part of the building's non-separated, part of the building's separated, and some parts are accessory occupancies. It gets very complicated, and in some ways, it can work towards your advantage by doing that, by thinking that out strategically, and making it work in your favor. And then there's a little separate table, 509, that gets into what we call incidental uses. These are uses that could be classified under another occupancy group, but they're incidental to that particular building. And it's usually storage rooms, laundry rooms, boiler rooms, air conditioning equipment rooms, things like that. So if it's an incidental use, then you have to follow requirements there. It's either provide a sprinkler system for the incidental use, or if the building is sprinklered, then it becomes kind of a non-issue, or you can separate it with a 1-hour fire barrier. So this is when I was talking about special uses. So even though you've classified the building under Chapter 3 for an occupancy group, in some cases you may have a building that is kind of unique within that occupancy group that you have to apply additional requirements. And so some of the more common ones are shown there, but I'm going to go through the entire list. It's actually 3 slides worth of special uses and occupancies that are addressed in this particular chapter. So you got covered mall and open mall buildings, high-rise buildings, atriums, those things you'll probably run into on a rather regular occasion. Underground building is any building with the floor more than 30 feet below the grade plane. Motor vehicle related, this is your parking garages, open or enclosed parking garages, private garages, public garages, and then vehicle repair shops. Group I2, your hospitals. Group I3, your prisons and detainment centers. Motion projection, picture projection rooms. It's just becoming a less and less of a problem in this digital age, since most of our movie theaters are going digital rather than film. The problem was the cellulose film is very flammable, and you had a lot of fires. Flammable film with projectors with high heat light bulbs, not a good combination. A lot of fires started in the projector rooms. And then stages, platforms, and technical production areas, the scaffolding and everything associated with production type facilities. Special amusement areas, this is where Disney lives in. Aircraft related occupancies, hangars, that type of thing, aircraft painting hangars. Combustible storage, hazardous materials, whether or not you're a Group H building or not. If you have combustible materials or hazardous materials, you still have to follow this particular section in Chapter 4. And then the next one that gets into the Group H high hazard occupancy groups. Spray application of flammable finishes, drying rooms, artificial decorative vegetation, which is kind of important if anybody's familiar with the Coconut Grove fire in was it in Boston, I believe. That was all started because of decorative vegetation in the dance room. And then special occupancies for residential, Group I1, which is your residential care homes, R1, R2, and R3 is your hotel motels, apartments, and single family detached or duplex dwelling units, respectively. And then some things that you may or may not get into, these are getting less and less common. Hydrogen fuel gas rooms, ambulatory care facilities you may run into on occasion. Storm shelters if you're especially in the Midwest for tornadoes. Play structures used to be called children play structures. Now we got play structures for adults too. So uh, they just took out the children. Um, uh, Hyperbaric facilities, combustible dust, grain processing. So it's mostly agricultural there. And then if you're into higher ed or healthcare, medical gas systems, and then higher education laboratories. A lot within that one single chapter. Next step 7 is to determine your allowable height and area. And this is kind of dependent upon whether or not you're doing a separation of occupancies, because you can separate occupancies by horizontal assembly and in the vertical instance. So if one occupancy allows you to go higher and one occupancy it has a low story height, you just separate it, put the low story height at the lower floors and continue up with the higher height occupancy group and separate it by horizontal assembly. So it really depends upon the separation of the occupancy. Tables 504.3 and 504.4 talk about heights. One is based on stories, the other one is based on feet, and it's all mostly dictated by construction type, but occupancy group also has plays a factor in that. And then the allowable areas are what we call tabulated areas in 506.2. It used to be these were all congregated into a single table, 503, with the exception of the heights by in feet, and they separated these. It kind of made a difference, but kind of did not, in my opinion. And then any application of increases. Matter of fact, the tables now already automatically include the sprinkler increase. If you so you have, there's choices there. If you're non-sprinklered, sprinklered one-story, or multi-story sprinklered building, and that'll dictate the allowable areas for that. So you don't have to calculate that anymore. So the only increase that you need to add, if any, is for a separation increase around the building and based on the fire separation distance. So if you find yourself in a situation where you've gone through the whole process up to this point and your building either exceeds allowable height or exceeds allowable area, what are some things that you can do? And one is just go to a higher construction type. If you're type 5, go to 4 or 3, or maybe even jump to 2B, which is a non-fire resistance rated, non-combustible building. That'll give you a little more allowable area and height in some cases. So that may be enough of a jump to get you where you need to be. Another one option is if you don't want to go to a higher construction type is to break your building up into smaller buildings using firewalls. Although each building separated by a firewall is treated separately in regards to area and height, the whole building is still considered a single building for the purposes of electrical supply, power supply, and things like that. Fire lines going into the building for the sprinkler systems, things like that. So it's still treated as a single building, but for purposes of height and area, it's multiple buildings. Is maximize your increase. If you don't have a sprinkler system right in the building right now, maybe add that sprinkler system. That'll give you a significant boost just by doing that alone. And then if not, then look at a frontage increase for fire separation distance. Another option is take a look at section 507, which has requirements for buildings that have unlimited area. If you're in a building that meets the criteria for one of those options, it might be a good idea just to go that route, and then you're dealing with an unlimited area building. You don't have to worry about height or floor area. Next step is to calculate your occupant load, and this is going to be based on your preliminary floor areas at this stage, unless you got a floor plan already. But if you don't, you can still calculate it based off the program areas and get a rough order of what your occupant load is going to be. And then you're going to keep coming back and readdressing this over and over again as the design develops. And that either may tighten or may increase. So you have to be very aware of what you're doing when you're manipulating spaces during the design process. And the reason why this is so important because that number, whatever occupant load you come up with, is going to be used to determine the number of exits that are going to be required for the building, what your exit width requirements are going to be, and the number of plumbing fixtures that you're going to have in that building. Step 9 is to establish points of exit. Everything is, I tell my students this, 2 exits, regardless. Provide me 2 exits. Then you have to take a look at the table to see if you need to go higher. Most buildings, unless you're an assembly building, is probably going to be less than 500 occupants and per story, and all you need is 2 exits. Anything higher than that, 501 to 1,000, you're required to have 3 exits, and anything over 1,000, 4 exits. You may have be permitted 1 exit if permitted by section 1021.2. When you're required to have at least 2 or more exits, at least 2 of those exits have to be separated by 1/2 the overall diagonal if it's unsprinkled, or 1/3 the overall diagonal of that area being egressed for a sprinkler system. So 1/2 the overall diagonal of that space, non-sprinklered, 1/3 the overall diagonal for buildings that are sprinklered. And that's the separation between at least 2 exits. Not all 3 or all 4 exits have to be separated by that distance, but at least 2 of them do. So here's that illustration again. So when we talk about exits, this is the stage that we're at. This is the point where a person is either entering a protected element of the means of egress system, an enclosed stairway that takes them down to the grade, what we call the level of exit discharge. There we go. Now I spit it out. And that takes them out to the exterior of the building, or have an exterior door that takes you directly to the outside on horizontal grade, or horizontal passageway, horizontal exits and exit passageways are all protected means of egress that allow people to stay within the building, but they're protected from the fire source inside the building until they get out of the building. Next is to check your egress pathways. So now you've got your building layout, you've identified where your exits are. You want to make sure that your pathways to those exits meet certain requirements. So you wanted to look for what are the travel distances. So measure from the most remote point in each room to an exit. And that distance must be less than or equal to the travel distance allowed by the code. And that's all in Chapter 10. Also look for what we call the common path of egress travel. The definition has changed a little over time, but essentially what it is, it's a pathway where people must travel regardless until they have to a point where they have at least 2 separate and distinct paths to 2 separate exits. So if everybody has to follow a certain path in order to get to a point where they can go right or left or forward or to another direction to reach 2 separate exits, that common path that they travel cannot exceed a certain distance. In most cases, it's 75 feet. In certain circumstances, you can increase that to 100 feet. Look for dead-end corridors. In most cases, the dead-end corridor is no more than corridor end that is no more than 20 feet. In some circumstances, you can increase that to 50 feet with a sprinkler system. In some cases, you can increase that a little bit more for residential. Um, the common path can also be increased by widening the corridor to a point that the width is 2.5 times or the length is no more than 2.5 times the width of or is at least 2.5 times the width of the corridor. So the wider you make it, the deeper you can go with a dead end corridor. And then also look for accessible means of egress. Uh, if you're required to have two or more exits, you have to have at least two accessible means of egress. And there are certain elements that are acceptable for an accessible means of egress. And yet in chapter 10, actually section 1009 gets into that list. One of them is an elevator, but if you use an elevator, you have to meet certain criteria for that elevator, such as standby power. So the exit access is where the pathways are. And this is kind of starts in the room. In most cases, there may be certain open stairs or unenclosed, what we call exit access stairs that maybe go between the second and third floor, but don't continue all the way down to the ground. Those are considered exit access stairs. They cannot be called exits. Egress balconies, balconies on the outside, like if you're familiar with a lot of motels where the entrances are on the outside and you got those balconies that connect all the doorways. Some apartment complexes are like that as well. So travel distance and measuring from the most remote point. I didn't want to get too technical, but I want to point this out because this is something I see frequently. The reason why we measure travel distance the way we do is because of this. Most rooms are going to have a series of furnishings in it. So to go from the most remote point in that room to that doorway on the opposite corner, you're going to have to do a zigzag pattern through all the furnishings. You cannot do this. So, and I see a lot of diagrams that come across my desk from architects wanting me to review their drawings, and I see this and I tell them, no, you can't do that. If you took the dimension here and looked at that dimension there, that distance, it would be the same. So if you follow an orthogonal path to the exit, that'll maximize the travel distance to that particular exit access door or exit door. Step 11, determine fixture counts. Could be a very complex. I can speak for at least an hour, hour and a half on determining fixture counts. Again, this is going to be based on that occupant load that we calculated back in step 8. And this is going to be broken down by classification. They don't call it occupancy group anymore. It used to be under occupancy group. So now you can kind of group certain areas of buildings, even though they may be classified as a certain occupancy group. You can put them together under a single classification and group them that way because they're all associated with that main occupancy or that main use, and just apply it as an umbrella calculation to cover the entire area. But those fixture counts, you have to deal with it 50-50, 50 male, 50 female, and you have to provide fixtures in accordance with the table. They are allowing single use or single user toilet rooms grouped together for non-gender specific application. However, the total number of fixtures still have to add up to the requirement for male and female. So if you're required to have 4 water closets for males, 5 water closets for females, if you want to lump them together and make them non-gender specific, you have to provide 9 water closets that anybody can use. And they all be in individual toilet rooms, and then you can have a congregate lavatories on the outside, same calculation, same number of fixtures based on both calculations. Uh, Step 12 is identify your fire department access roads. Here you have to go to IFC section 503, so you have to look at the fire code. In this instance, if they adopted Appendix D of the IFC, then that gives you some further criteria about turnarounds and things like that. Otherwise, your fire department may have specific criteria in lieu of an Appendix D. The fire access road must be within 150 feet of all portions of the exterior walls at the first floor. The road must be at least 20 feet wide and have a 13-foot, 6-inch vertical clearance. So when we say 150 feet from the fire lane, this is not what we're talking about. Draw an arc, yeah, everything's within 150 feet. No, this is what they mean. You have to go from the road around the perimeter. And if you go around and find yourself short, you're going to have to make that up with a fire lane. And you can do that by increasing the fire lane, adding a fire lane to cover the gap, or put a fire lane all the way around. Another way to increase this is to add a sprinkler system. If you add a sprinkler system, there is an option that the code official can increase the distance around the perimeter from 150 feet. In some jurisdictions, they'll double that. Some jurisdictions, they'll just give you 50 additional feet, so it's 200 feet. That may be enough. So find out what the building official is willing to extend that if you have a sprinkler system. Step 13 is now look at your accessible routes. And this is not accessible means of egress. This is accessible routes for users coming into and using your building, going to all areas of the building that are required to be accessible. It is the intent that all buildings and structures on the site are required to be accessible, and you need to follow ICC ANSI standard A117.1. If you're in the 21 IBC or later, you're under the 2017 edition of the ANSI standard. Prior to that is the 2009 edition. The 2017 edition goes above and beyond the ADA, so you have to be aware of that. If you're still just following the ADA, you will not be following the building code in regards to accessibility if you're using the 21 or the 24 IBC. Here's kind of a chronological history of accessibility. It first started off with the Architectural Barriers Act in 1963, which applied to only government facilities. That was followed by the Unified Facility Accessibility Standard, or Federal Accessibility Standard, excuse me, in 1988. This is basically implemented or gave criteria that federal buildings need to follow in order to comply with the ABA. So it took 20 years to come up with a standard. And then in 1990, the ADA was passed that required everybody else to comply with the accessibility standards. And shortly thereafter, they came out with the ADAG, the accessibility guidelines. And that had not changed until 2004 when they combined the ADA and the ABA guidelines and made them more in line with one another. However, at 2004, it took the Justice Department another 6 years to come up with the 2010 ADA standards to implement those 2004 revisions. So, and then the ANSI A117.1, which I just mentioned, the 2009 and 2017 editions. 2009 edition of the ANSI standard follows very closely with the 2010 ADA standards. There are differences. So if you've got a vertical grab bars, you're required to have those under the ANSI standards. You're not required to have them in the ADA. I know we're getting a little close here. Design development,
Yeah,
step
I'm sorry.
14.
I'm gonna jump in here real quick because we do only have about 5 minutes left. So this seems like a natural spot. I don't think we can get through 14 more steps, but this is
Yeah.
very much whetting our appetite. So a couple of things I want to give a little bit. We've got like 5 minutes left. If anybody has any questions, feel free to turn on your camera or ask. I don't see any stacked up right now. There's a lot to take in here to digest. Does anybody have any specific questions for schematic design? I don't see any popping up. Oh, somebody's saying, can Ron come back and finish the rest of the steps? So we
Oh,
can,
I'll be happy to do that at a chapter meeting or something. But
well,
uh,
another question I have is, I get asked this every meeting. Will this be available as not a leave behind, but will this presentation be available?
oh, you want me to make a? I can make a PDF of it, the slides, if that's what you're asking.
Yes, yes. I'm sorry that specifically that's what we get asked quite a bit. So I know that that would be very helpful if that's available and we can do that. But I do think that following up with the second version of this from design development on, Ron, if you're available, maybe in the new year, I don't know which month that would you we'll talk to you about coming back for that. Would you mind?
No, I'd be happy to.
That'd be fantastic. And then everybody can kind of get a handle on SD, and I'm sure they'll have their DD and CD questions at that time then too. This is super helpful. Any other questions or feedback?
The only thing I want to add, I've been kind of behind the scenes trying to get the survey set up for each of the 4 parts. You should get at the end of this uh, a when we close out the webinar, if you hang on, it'll give you an option to redirect to CSINext for part 1 of the webinar survey. If you don't get that link, you should get a follow-up tomorrow. If you don't get either of those and you really want that CEU, which all of these, including this one here, has been registered with the AIA as an HSW. So we'll get those in as soon as we get that list. Usually takes a couple days. But on the About CSI, you'll see an option for webinar survey. It's kind of more of a generic one, not specific to this webinar. Just put, you were in attendance at part 1. If you don't get any of those links in the comments of that form, and we will make sure that you get that, or absolute worst case, send an email.
Thank you, Daniel. Ron, I'm so sorry to suspend this, but I think that it's the best teaser for the next. And I love how this is ending for design development, confirm steps 2 to 13. We've all got our homework. And so we will start practicing what you are preaching. And we appreciate so much your time and expertise today.
No problem. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed this. I
Absolutely.
love
Thanks,
talking about code.
Ron.
We need you, Ron. We need you. So we will see you again soon, next in the upcoming months. Okay.
All
Well,
right.
with that, we will wrap up part 1. And for those of you that are going to be joining us for part 2, we're taking a 15-minute break to get the next speaker up and ready to go. And we'll see you 15 past the hour, wherever you are. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks. See you soon.